Hello and welcome to Thursday Thoughts again as we continue and near completion of our study of the book of Daniel. And last week we looked at an incredible glimpse into the spirit world and to spiritual warfare as Daniel had fasted, or at least a Daniel fast, for 3 weeks and prayed, believing that God would send the interpretation of his fourth and final vision. And we saw the incredible intervention of Michael the archangel. Took a little bit of an expanded look at some spiritual warfare examples in Scripture, and I hope those were a blessing to you. Today we move to chapter 11, which is basically the bulk of the interpretation of that fourth vision. And I'll be honest with you, includes an incredible amount of detail. I've actually warred with myself a little bit about how much of that to dive into. But let's see how it goes. Now, I need to remind you that when we looked at chapter 8, we basically got an expanded view of chapter 7. This content of chapter 11 reminds me a little bit of that idea of zooming in closer for more detail than has previously been revealed in the past. And I think you will see that. I'm going to be honest. I am amazed at God's overview of history and his presentation of that to Daniel with an amount of detail that we can't possibly fathom. We would have to get a pretty detailed history book to get the amount of information that God shared with Daniel in advance. So I think you will see that as we move into this content. Now, the content of chapter 11 divides pretty logically into some parts. The first 2 verses deal with the rulers of Persia that were yet to come. Verses 3 through 20 deal with very detailed history of Greece, some of which we've seen, some of which we have not seen. Verses 25 through 35 deal with Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabean era, again with more detail than we've seen. The last section, no doubt, shifts to the Antichrist. Now, there are a few that would argue with me there, but I just believe the details don't match up any other way. Now, in addition to a ton of other rulers, there are 5 very important rulers who are introduced to us with details in chapter 11. And interestingly enough, all 5 of them have names that begin with A. The first one is Ahasuerus of Persia. He ruled from 486 to 465 BC. And remember, he was the king who married Esther, and the most powerful ruler of the world to date at that point in time in history. The next was Alexander the Great of Greece. The third was Antiochus the Third, and he was called the Great. And then Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and the last one, the Antichrist. Now again, there will be lots of other rulers, but particularly pay attention to those 5. Now, we believe that the prophecies of this chapter were probably recorded about 536 BC. If that's true, the content of the first couple of verses started being fulfilled only 6 years later in about 530 BC. When the first of those 3 more kings that we're going to hear referenced rose to power, the content begins to unfold before us, and to a point, through a good portion of the chapter, it happens in sequential order as history records it. Now, I remind you again, skeptics don't like the amount of detail that God revealed. They argue that no way could that happen except having this content be written after the fact as a recording of history rather than a prophetic prediction of what would come to pass. I guess for the entirety of this book, if you want to come down to it, the basic question is, can you accept the omniscience and the sovereignty of God. If you can't, then the whole content of this book will give you difficulty. Let's go now to chapter 11 and look particularly at the first 4 verses. I'm reading from the New King James Version today. Follow along with me. Beginning verse 1. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, I, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now I need to pause here. If you remember at the end of chapter 10, Daniel is being told why he has this visitor who's going to share this interpretation and what is going to occur. So his visitor is continuing to talk here. Verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. Now notice again the reference to 3 kings and then a 4th mighty king. We're talking about the future of the Persian Empire here. Remember, I told you the Persian Empire lasted a long time, over 200 years. And in our discussion last week, you'll recall that when Cyrus was ruling, he was the one who gave the Jews permission to return home, rebuild Jerusalem, restore the temple. And if you recall, only about 50,000 Jews had done that, which greatly concerned Daniel. Now, the kings that followed Cyrus are the 3 that we mention here, with the 4th one being even more powerful. So we basically just slide over those 3 kings that aren't as important. They were Cambyses, son of Cyrus, Pseudo-Smerdis, and Darius the Great. Those are the 3 that we kind of blink over. Then comes the 4th one, Ahasuerus, the one who, as I told you, was ruling when Esther married him. He's also known as Xerxes. Let me remind you that remember he had 120 satraps and his kingdom was broad. It basically covered everything from India to Ethiopia. He was no doubt the mightiest king on the earth until he was defeated by Alexander the Great. Now, verses 3 and 4 that I read to you, no doubt, discuss Alexander the Great. Nothing else fits. Now, we've already talked about him. He was the bronze portion of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. He was the great horn on the goat in chapter 8. And he is definitely remarkable and renowned in history and ruled with great dominion. Did you hear what the word said? According to his will, he did what he wanted to. Remember, I told you earlier, he never lost a battle. But I have to tack on to that. He eventually became a drunken carouser with low morals and poor standards of morality and decency. And when he died as that young man, he died basically without leaving an heir prepared to take over his kingdom. Now, there were some potential heirs, all right. One was a brother who had a mental problem. He had an illegitimate son who basically had no right to claim the throne, but his wife was expecting. Now, here's what happened. Within a few months of Alexander's death, and we still, there are so many conjectures about what killed him. I've read interesting articles on that even lately. If you're interested, look that up. Within a few months, those heirs who weren't good choices were all murdered. That speaks to what kind of world that was during that point in time. So his kingdom was broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven. Remember the wording of the passage that I read. So all of those things that are described throughout the book of Daniel about Alexander the Great, his kingdom, what happened to it, without putting names to it and specifics that the history books might record in terms of those details, there is so much information here that it couldn't be describing anything else. Now, when we go on into the next section, starting in verse 5, we spend some time talking about kings of Egypt. Now, remember, 4 quadrants of Alexander's empire. The one that received the area that we know as Egypt also controlled Palestine in the beginning, and that was Ptolemy the First. There were battles between those 4 generals who inherited Alexander's empire. None of them really strong enough to dominate the whole thing, but because of wars and things that developed, 2 areas turned out to be dominant above the others. And that was the area controlling Egypt and what we know as the Seleucid Empire area, which controlled portions of Asia and included what we know as Syria. So you will see as we go into this section that wrangling for power has developed. Now, if you think about it, when we talk about kings of the south, we're going to be talking about Egypt due south of the Holy Land of Palestine, of the glorious land, whichever term you want to find, and there will be several. If you think about Syria and portions of Asia, that is kind of north, a little bit northeast, but the general direction. So when we talk about kings of the south and kings of the north, we're looking at those areas with Palestine sandwiched between them. So the wrangling between these 2 sections automatically impacted the Holy Land. People tromped through, different ones conquered, and they passed that control back and forth depending on the tide of the battles. So you can see what an incredible period of unrest this would have been for the Holy Land. And I'll be honest, this period lasted about 150 years. So it was not a pleasant period of time. Go with me now to begin our reading again at verse 5. Also, the king of the south, remember we associate that with Egypt, shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north, remember we associate with Syria, to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. I'll explain that story in a minute. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, either the fortress of the king of the north, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Now, the first king of the south that we're referring to here is Ptolemy the First Soter, and he ruled from 323 to about 285 BC, a pretty good amount of time. And the prince, or the commander of the prince that was mentioned here, is Seleucus the First Nicator. After this power struggle that I described, and Syria and Egypt establishing their dominance over the other 2, we see that a series of Egyptian kings is kind of skimmed over here, kind of like the Persian kings I mentioned earlier. Those would include King Ptolemy II of Egypt, and his daughter's story is the story that I mentioned in the middle that I would come back to, because King Ptolemy II of Egypt gave his daughter Berenice to Antiochus VII Theos of Syria to establish an alliance. Now, if you're a history buff, you know it's not uncommon at all for an alliance to be kind of confirmed by marrying heirs or people in the royal family of two countries together. So in order to seal this alliance, Berenice is given to Antiochus II. However, there's a problem. He divorced Laodice, his first wife, in order to marry this second wife. And she was not a happy camper. She was power hungry, she was wicked, and she was vindictive. So when Berenice's father, Ptolemy II, died, about the same time, this scorned first wife, Laodice, poisons Antiochus II and murders Berenice and her son. Now, verse 6 and the prophecies it includes are pretty much fulfilled there, which is interesting. A lot of experts say before you finish chapter 11, you've seen the fulfillment of about 135 prophecies. That's pretty amazing. All right, now, so we've got a murdered princess and her child murdered. And what we see then is that Berenice's brother sets out to seek revenge for his sister's murder. And so he attacks and defeats Syria under Seleucus II. And so when he enters that fortress, which was probably Syrian Antioch, he carries away the gods of the Syrians. He carries away the Egyptian gods that had been taken earlier by Cambyses. He steals the riches and the ruins, and he goes back home, but not before he executes Laodice for what she has done to his family. Now, though Ptolemy III returns to Egypt with a lot of plunder, he does not attack Syria again. He basically lets that rest. Now, Seleucus tries later to go back and kind of raid Egypt to steal back what was taken, but he was defeated and forced to return to Egypt. And you get an idea of not only the battles, but the intrigue that defined this period of time. Now, when we go back to the scriptures and start to again see these progressions of kings, we're going to be introduced to Antiochus III. Now, you remember he's the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a type of the Antichrist. Go with me now back to chapter 11, and let's begin our reading at verse 10. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to read a lengthy passage of 10 verses, but we're going to deal with some of these kings and move to our next example of intrigue. Verse 10, however, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Now, what we're talking here is that the sons of Antiochus II, the descendants and heirs, are going to be upset because Ptolemy III has defeated them and carried off their valuables and their gods. And so you're going to see what results. And when a battle was won or lost, things didn't stay there. There was just a brief period of time till the next person was ready to stir up trouble. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife at the end of verse 10. Verse 11. And the king of the south, remember that's Egypt, shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him. And the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will be cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people. Now let me pause right here. When the reference is made to your people and you're talking to Daniel, then you have to be talking about some Jews. Now, violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women. I'll break in right here. He's talking about Cleopatra, and I will come back to that, to destroy it. But she shall not stand with him or before him. After this he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. Now, back to verse 10, and let's see if we can sort through these kings. The difficult thing when we're reading Daniel's version is he's recording events that are going to happen, minus the names of who is going to do those things. So we look at that and some people say, well, I don't see it. But when you compare what he writes with history books and fill in the names, the details are so exact, it will blow your mind. Now, verse 10 is talking about sons of kings of the south. So, sons of the kings of Egypt. And he introduces us to Antiochus III, who is a king of the north from the Syrian area. Now, most of the beginning battles the Antiochus had with kings of Egypt ended in Antiochus III being defeated. But eventually he pieces together enough troops and enough strategy to win a series of victories, and those are described basically in verses 10 through 16. Now, beginning in verse 17, history buffs are going to recognize the lady I mentioned earlier, and her name is Cleopatra. Now, here's what Antiochus III did. He gave his daughter, Cleopatra, who was 11 years old at the time, to Ptolemy V of Egypt, who was 12 years old at the time. But the whole arrangement was not exactly on the up and up. The agenda in giving Cleopatra to Ptolemy V was his hope that he could ultimately have complete control over Egypt. He was looking for a way of control through the back door, so to speak. Now remember, we've got these two portions of the Grecian Empire who have proved to be dominant over the other two who are weaker. But between those two, there are constant battles for total dominance. And so here, Antiochus III has tried to attack Egypt's coastal cities in about 200 BC, but he was crushed. Ptolemy V Epiphanes defeated him, Now, he gained more strength. He tried to attack what we heard described as the fenced cities, probably the well-fortified city of Sidon or something similar to that. And by a couple of years later, sometime in the range of 199 to 197 BC, he had taken control of the glorious land, or Palestine, or the Holy Land, as you choose to refer to it. Now, he was defeated in Asia Minor in about 190 BC because Roman troops were beginning to present themselves into the mix of things and were gaining some strength. Here's what's interesting. He expected his daughter to stand with him, but she didn't. She aligned herself with her husband, and so all of his subterfuge and all of his little plots didn't get him anywhere. And so by the time he was defeated soundly enough that he goes back home kind of in shame, he's so angry, he goes back home and plunders his own land. That's pretty foolish. And he attacks and raids the temple of Jupiter. And his own people are so angry when he steals the treasure out of that temple that they rise up and murder him. Did you notice the end of that passage I read that basically suggests he kind of disappears? His own people killed him and nobody found his body. We have no clue what happened to him. But I need to point back again to what I said earlier. At the incredible prophetic detail that was fulfilled down to the point of our not knowing what happened to this man's body. Now, here's the thing. Verses 18 and 19 said he was going to turn toward the fortress of his own land, but he would stumble and fall and not be found. And that demise sets up the rise of Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, and we have met him in some pretty good detail before. Now, I remind you, that period of time I just described took about 150 years. So there was a lot of up and down, a lot of fight, a lot of try to get something by hook or crook. And through all of it, Israel became a pawn, and Israel's history during that period was extremely difficult. Now, go back with me. This time, we're in Daniel chapter 11, beginning our reading at verse 21. And watch for information that lines up with what we know about Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Remember, he basically considered himself God made manifest. He was arrogant, he was boastful, he was disdainful of anything holy, he hated the Jews, and we are going to see that in the way he conducted himself. And remember, he is a type of, a foreshadowing of the Antichrist. And I need to remind you, especially true in the day in which we live, as prophecy approaches fulfillment, there are shadows that indicate that fulfillment's on the way. We are living in another period of time that reflects that. But certainly Antiochus and his whole life reflects what the Antichrist will be. And it's because of what he will be that we will see what he will do. Verse 11, and in his place, in the place of Antiochus III, shall arise a vile person, notice that description, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. I'll explain that in a minute. But he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong, and with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. Remember, that's Egypt, with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. Listen to details. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For the ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Listen to that. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and shall carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Now hold up. Wow. There's a whole lot in there. Some of those little phrases along through there should have triggered memories of discussions that we've already had. Talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and what he did. Now, interestingly enough, when we talked about him before, we spent some significant time talking about the man himself, that he would be articulate, that he could sway people with his speech, that he would be charismatic, that he would be demonically empowered. You recall our discussion of those things. Here we basically have this historical account of all the things he's going to do because of the kind of person that he is. Now, did you notice the reference to the fact that he really doesn't deserve the honor of royalty? In fact, not at all. He gets the throne to the Syrian area of the Grecian Empire by deceit and by sly methodologies. Now, I'll tell you that the rightful heir to the throne should have been the son of Seleucus IV, and his name was Demetrius, and he was still a boy. But his uncle literally, by hook, crook, whatever you want to call it, he made sure that he was the one who received this honor, if you want to call it that. Notice that he killed the prince of the covenant. Did you hear that phrase? Lots of references to the covenant. I'll come back to those. Basically, that is a prophetic prediction that Antiochus Epiphanes was going to kill the high priest Onias III, and he did that in 170 BC. That reference was in verse 22 that I just read you. Now, he made treaties with nations, except they were dishonest and they were full of intrigue. And so basically he kept things stirred up. So you saw those battles with the South or with Egypt. He was unable to win on the battlefield right away. That's described in verse 27. And there was kind of a stalemate. So there was a sort of treaty that was agreed to. However, very quickly that was broken. Again, basically he kept no promises that he made. He made promises, he just didn't follow through with them. So after another failure, he's angry. Watch the pattern. When he's angry, he takes it out on Israel. So he develops this covenant, but because he hates them and he wants the Greek culture and the Greek language to be basically enforced on everyone because he believes it's superior, he decides that the religion of the Jews is an enemy to his agenda because the Jews' religion was exclusivist. Now, I have to pause right here because I need to remind you that believers, that there is only one way, that Jesus Christ is the only way that we can be reconciled in our relationship with God, the only way that we can make heaven our home, puts us basically in the same category. And that is why very often we are criticized and condemned even today in the world in which we live. So they're exclusivist. They don't want to embrace all the gods of the Greeks. They don't understand the Greek language is better. They don't understand Greek culture is superior. So he hates them for their belief in God. Listen to that, in the one true God. So he invades Egypt again. But the ships of Cyprus are waiting for him. And there is a Roman consul by the name of Linnaeus. And he is, I think I mispronounced that, forgive me. He is in charge. And again, remember, the Romans are beginning to kind of build some power here. And so he defeats Antiochus Epiphanes, so he goes back home again. But now he's really mad now. So he invades Jerusalem in a rage. He murders and rapes women. He slaughters children on sight. He takes away the daily sacrifices. He tells them you can't circumcise your babies. You can't keep your observation of the Sabbath day. You can't follow dietary practices that are kosher. You can't do any of those things that are inherent and most important in the way you worship your God. He puts the temple, the statue of Zeus in the temple. He builds an altar to Zeus and demands that the people worship him. Now, that's actually the abomination of desolation. The fact that we've now got this altar and you're supposed to worship this idol, and I'm not going to let you do anything that relates to the way that you worship your God. But you should offer your burnt sacrifices here on this altar to Zeus. You can just about imagine the state of the Jews. And then he offers the pig on the altar. I didn't tell you before when we discussed this. He slings blood all over the temple from this pig, basically desecrating everything in there that had been set apart to the worship of the one true God. On top of that, in a way to shame them, he force feeds pork to the priests, makes them gagging swallow it. Now, we already know there was a family of the Hasmonean priestly line that took a stand against him and against what he was doing to force the Jews to stop the observances that they were accustomed to. Of course, by now the temple's desecrated. There is nothing they can do in the way of worship there. They can't even go to the temple because of what he's done. But this small band of Jewish patriots that Daniel prophesied would come takes a stand and basically uses guerrilla warfare to fight Antiochus, the troops that he has there, and what he's done. And as I said before, the story of this family and their actions and the steps that they took in defense of God and of Israel, that's all recorded in First Maccabees. Now, Judas Maccabeus did everything he could. Judas Maccabeus was not the Messiah. He was not the deliverer, but he did eventually cause enough trouble that Antiochus took his armies home, after which the temple was cleansed, the lamps were relit, and the worship could be restored. And I need you to understand that the celebration of the Feast of Hanukkah is still carried on to commemorate relighting those relighting those lamps and cleaning that temple. I'm thinking of lamp and temple together. Relighting the lamps and cleansing the temple. Now, I know that it was a big deal that the temple was cleaned and worship could be restored. But both at this point and as we move forward, God was not and is not finished with the Jews. And as much as it is tragic, his dealings with the Jews will often involve their suffering as he tries to purify a remnant that will accept Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. Now, there is a drastic shift between verses 35 and 36. Some will argue that that's not true, but I feel there is, and leading Bible scholars feel that there is a major shift here. Some want to say that the discussion continues about Antiochus, but I need to remind you, as we have worked through the first 35 verses of chapter 11, we've basically moved through history in order progressively. If you give in to the argument that there's not a shift here, then you start shaking things up and they're no longer in order. What's really happening here is that we are moving forward centuries in time, and we are going to begin a detailed discussion of the Antichrist and what he has done. And it actually carries over this discussion into the first three verses, at least the first three verses of chapter 12. So join me now. I'm in verse 36 of chapter 11. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. Now, did you hear what I said? It says then. He's going to lift himself up, do according to his own will, and blaspheme God. Sequentially, that makes no sense at all. So definitely a shift here. Verse 37. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortresses, and a god which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones, and with pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge, and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for gain. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels, but news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountains. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Now, it's not new that Antiochus Epiphanes is presented in parallel with in comparison to the Antichrist. That intention is clearly established even in just verses 36 to 39. Now, some would argue, some Bible scholars, that once we hit the second half of the book of Daniel, starting in chapter 7, all of that is moving toward this final description of the Antichrist. Now, clearly, Antiochus Epiphanes can't be the final ruler. We know that. And there is a reference in verse 35 to the time of the end. So we get the clear, distinct impression that we're talking about the end of time as the Gentile kingdoms will be marked and the Antichrist will be the last of those rulers. Now, the atrocities of Antiochus have already been listed. This is a new group of atrocities. And notice what it talks about. It says that he won't regard the God of or gods of his fathers. He won't regard what's desired by women. Some people think that's a reference to the Babylonian fertility god. A reference for that would be Ezekiel 8:14. I don't know what that means. We know that he is going to be destructive and totally disrespectful to women, murderous to children, beyond sacrilegious, beyond blasphemous, beyond what we can even comprehend or understand. Now, it says the only God he's going to really honor is the God of force. Did you notice that? And that may be a reference to his own ability to conduct battles and wars and to be victorious. Now, I do want you to notice that he's not going to control the world. We are clearly told that he is going to invade the Holy Land, but he is not going to control Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Now, those names ought to be really familiar to you because Edom, those originally were the descendants of Esau, who did not inherit the birthright that Jacob got, but still God blessed him. The other two are the descendants of Lot. And though obviously the promises were all given to Abraham that through his seed the world would be blessed, but God also blessed Lot. And so these areas that are listed are represented roughly by the country of Jordan today, which is interesting because it is due east of Israel. That's an interesting thought. So what is the Antichrist going to do? Whatever he wants to, verse 36. Who will he truly worship? Himself. He's going to deify himself, verse 36. He will defy the true God, verse 36. He will disregard the religion of the Jews and the religion of his fathers, whatever that was established to be, verse 37. He will devote himself to military endeavors, verse 38. He'll declare war against many foreign powers, verse 39. He'll defend himself against other nations, verse 40. He'll defeat a lot of those enemies, verse 41. He'll develop great wealth, verse 43. But ultimately, he's going to be defeated and nobody can help him, verse 45. That much is clearly established and will be as it has been predicted to be. Now, we already know that he's going to be defeated by Jesus Christ on a white horse. Every time I read that description, I'm moved to tears, and I tell people we're going to ride. Those of us who go in the rapture are coming back on horses to ride with Jesus, but we don't have to do any fighting because the word of his mouth is going to destroy the Antichrist. And so this chapter ends on that note of promising that he'll be destroyed. Now, hurriedly, I'm going to try to tie up the loose ends with verse 12. Interestingly enough, the first part of chapter 12 talks about prophecies of the end times. They continue from chapter 11. But the second part talks about the end of prophecies and what happens when all is finished. let's look at the introduction of chapter 12, the first 3 verses. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered. Remember, that's Daniel's people. Every one who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever. Now, end time events, if we were to sum those up: a world ruler, a world religion, a world war, great tribulation for Israel, deliverance of the people of God, resurrection and judgment, reward of the righteous. Now, this period of time we're talking about is sometimes called the time of Jacob's trouble, sometimes called the Great Tribulation. It's mentioned in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7, also Matthew 24 and verse 21. So we're talking about the second half of the tribulation known as the Great Tribulation. So between the end of chapter 11 and the first part of chapter 12, we see that there is a connection, and that little phrase, "at that time," demonstrates and confirms that connection. So at the time the Antichrist is defeated, at that time, going into chapter 12, we see what's going to happen. And notice it said, it made a reference to Michael standing up. Some people think that this is kind of a little bit of a throwback and a reference to a war that took place in heaven. It's described in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. Satan and his angels were kicked out, and you know what his agenda became: destroy, torment the Jews, cause as many people to end up in hell as he possibly can. So that time of tribulation for Israel became the agenda of a deposed worship leader in heaven. I think it's very important to note that in Matthew 24, Jesus himself refers to the prophecies that Daniel recorded. That's going to become very important here in just a minute. It helps us also to understand a little bit of first century culture. Now, we're going to see references to the book of life and to 2 resurrections. Resurrection of some to great joy and to ruling and reigning with Christ, resurrection of others to the horrors of the great white throne judgment. Now, the names written in this book of life, and this is a first reference for the Old Testament, would be godly Jews, would be the remnant at the end of the tribulation who have accepted Jesus as Messiah and know that he is their Savior and Lord, and have been rescued out of the tribulation period. Ezekiel 10 verses 30 to 38 say that God basically is going to purge Israel of those who are rebellious and those who are disobedient, and the remnant that's left will be committed. Zechariah 13 verses 8 and 9 basically suggests that about 2/3 of the Jews will be cut off or will be lost. And that third that remains after the horrors of the tribulation, those who have been brought through the fire, will have been refined as silver and tested as gold. Those will call on the name of the Lord. At the end of the Old Testament, in Malachi chapter 3, we're told that God's going to preserve that godly Jewish remnant, and he will use the tribulation for that sifting process. Now, when verse 2 mentions resurrection, that is not proof that everybody's going to be resurrected. That's not true. We know that there are actually 3 groups that will be a portion of the millennial reign of Christ. The saints who go in the rapture, those who have come through the tribulation, have survived, have not taken the mark of the beast, have come to accept the Savior, they're still alive, those who've been martyred. And I probably should, as a side note, mention those who died in the faith before Jesus Christ, who are touted in Hebrews 11 and who received Jesus when he went to paradise, when it appeared he was in a tomb. And remember, the book of Ephesians records that he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. So for all of those groups, the millennial reign will become an incredible time of sharing rule and reign with Jesus Christ. So it's interesting also that there's a 1,000-year gap between the references to those two resurrections. To the righteous who have been martyred, those who are going into the millennial reign because they've taken a stand for the cause of Christ, and then later to those who are headed for judgment. So just because, remember what I told you before, just because there's a mention of a couple of things in the same verse doesn't mean that sequential order is close. There's a 1,000-year gap there. The main point in this chapter is the fact that those who are resurrected because they died for their faithfulness to God, those are going to be raised to rule and to reign. There is a day when purified Israel is going to become what God intended them to be. Verse 3 talks about teachers who are wise, people who have insight into the times and teach others. And it appears that during the tribulation, those who have known of the prophecies of Daniel are going to have this information to draw from and are actually going to use it to teach others, which is going to become very important as it becomes necessary for those who are left to have an opportunity to accept Jesus Christ. There will also be courageous evangelists who help to bring many to faith. And these faithful teachers and evangelists are going to be rewarded with everlasting life. Again, the first time that's found in the Old Testament, and the first reference to it is in verse 2 here. And they will end up shining like the brightness of the firmament, like stars forever and ever. Now remember, the first 3 verses continued our discussion of the prophecies. The last 3 talk about when prophecies end. I need to remind you that 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 10 through 12 remind us that prophets recorded what God revealed to them, even though they didn't always totally understand what they were revealing, what the Holy Spirit had given to them to share. Very quickly, let me read this last section. I'm almost out of time and I'm trying to hurry. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Notice that. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood 2 others, one on this river bank and the other on that river bank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the firmament fulfillment of these wonders be? Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be fulfilled. Although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But you go your way until the end, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of these days. Now, Daniel's told to seal up the prophecy. That does not mean that God wants nobody to read this prophecy. He is telling Daniel, in fact, he tells him 3 times, you know, this prophecy is going to play an important role. Go on about your life, your routine. That encourages those of us who are elderly like he is. But these prophetic words are going to be available when they're needed, and there's coming a time when that will be critically important as people in the tribulation period can read, reread, and check and verify the truth. Can you imagine after time is all finished and all these things that he's predicted have come true, what those who are open and seeking the truth can understand. Now, Jesus said himself, those of you who are in Judea should run for the mountains when you see the abomination of desolation. And that's in Matthew 24, starting in verse 15. So Daniel's on the bank of the Tigris River again. We've seen him there before in chapter 10. And there are 3 visitors. Clearly 2 are angels, probably one on either side of the river. And then that 3rd visitor that's out over the water. I'm not going to get into the debate of who he was, whether or not that's another theophany or whether it's a 3rd angel and maybe Gabriel. The one probably on the same side of the river with Daniel basically says, how long until these things are going to happen? In other words, how long will the Antichrist be allowed to oppress the people of God during the tribulation? And then the answer is given. Notice that angel raises both hands. In Scripture, raising one hand, even in ancient times, it was very significant. It was like we do to swear that we're going to tell the truth, but raising both hands would have been very significant. And notice the answer is the Antichrist will rule over God's people a time, times, and a half a time. Now, a time is 1 unit. So that's a unit, 2 units, and half a unit, or 3.5 years. We know that reference is in Daniel 7:25, Revelation 11:2, 12:6, and 14, chapter 13 and verse 5. None of this is new. But the answer is foreboding, because clearly that end is not coming until the people of God have been completely shattered. And then the end of wonders will last as long as it takes for the Jews to be broken. Daniel has a question of his own. The angel's question was about when. Daniel's question is about what. What are the last things that will happen? And apparently Daniel's not supposed to know that. So again, in chapter 9, he's told to go on his way. But some hope is added, because clearly, after all of this persecution, there is going to come a glorious future for Israel, despite all the calamity that's been prophesied for them. Notice the reference to banning the daily sacrifices. That refers to the middle of the tribulation. Verses 11 and 12 are mysterious. What is all this business about days? Now, we've talked about prophetic years having 360 days in the past. So that would give us 1,260 days. And then there's a reference to a blessing for the one who waits to 1,335 days in verse 12, which adds 30 days. And before we digest that, there are 45 more days added. So, okay, we've got 1,260, then 30 more days, 1,290, and then 45 more days, 1,335. I don't mean to be confusing there. I'm trying to hurry. Now, so what is all this about? Some Bible scholars believe that after the Battle of Armageddon, there is going to be a transition period to usher in the rule and reign of Christ in the millennium. Some claim that the cleanup alone after that battle is going to be ridiculously overwhelming. I don't know. Scripture doesn't tell us, but clearly the full understanding of that is not described to Daniel. Again, in verse 13, he's told to go on with his life for the 3rd time. Keep on living all the way to the end. And Daniel, horrors await your people, but ultimately the end I have planned for them is going to come. Now hear me. Daniel spent his whole life in a foreign culture, just like we're in this world, but not of it, away from his home in Palestine. But God promises him one day that his life is going to end, but that he's going to be resurrected to the promises that are made to him. He's going to get part of the redistributed land. I didn't mention it before, but the Antichrist is going to redivide national borders and things to suit himself. But one day Israel is going to occupy all the territory that God promised them. Hear me. The shadows we now see are predictions of the prophecies that are coming. We see those increasingly in our day, but we don't worry. We're not looking for the Antichrist. We're looking for the Christ, and he's coming for us in the rapture. And we will not be back on this earth during the horrors of the tribulation until we come with that victorious rider of that white horse as he destroys the Antichrist and sets up his earthly kingdom with Satan, the false prophet, and the Antichrist cast alive into the lake of fire forever. Romans 13 verses 11 through 14 remind us that our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. So let me encourage you today. Daniel worked faithfully. God honored him in return. May the same thing be said of us. The next time I see you, I will be moving to Wednesday night to do a brand new Bible study, and I hope that you will join me then. In the meantime, let the lessons that we've learned from the book of Daniel motivate us to be what we ought to be until the return of Jesus Christ. God bless.